All right, folks, we're going live.
All righty. Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for Kitchen Cabinet Strategy Forum Part 4, Post-Election Check-In. How y'all doing today? With Shirley's Kitchen Cabinet, as y'all know, Shirley's Kitchen Cabinet is constantly on the post for the elections leading up, and we also want to be on the post checking on our family post-elections. And so Shirley's Kitchen Cabinet, it's a nonpartisan organization named after Shirley Chisholm, the wonderful, great, fierce Black woman who led us in the Congress. And so we want to honor her by continuing to do it in our work here with you today with our post-election wrap up and fill in. We have some awesome panelists with us today, Anoa, Kelvin, and Michelle. I'll let you do justice to introduce yourself and to give us some updates. But in these last couple of days, it's been a time of uncertainty, and we've all been on the edge of our seats. Or we all been great and doing and trying to be in this space and be prepared. So we want to take a moment to check on you, sis, check on our brothers, to see how you're doing, and to also take a moment to get us caught up with what's going on. And so I would like to pass it over to our panelists so they can introduce themselves and to tune in to where we are and get started with our conversation. So Kelvin, Simmons, would you jump in and give us introduction to yourself and who you are?
Thank you very much. I appreciate being here. And to introduce myself, I am Kelvin Simmons, native Kansas Cityan. I own a consultant lobbying government relations firm, the Nexus Group, which is a certified minority business enterprise in the state of Missouri. Prior to that, I have been a cabinet member for 3 different governors in the state of Missouri. I've been an elected official myself as a twice elected city council person. Basically helped run a presidential campaign and also a congressional campaign. So I've kind of got a background on the policy side, on the political side, and with all of that I've just said, I'm just old man Kelvin, so it's all good.
Thanks, Kelvin. Thank you. Anoa, could you introduce yourself?
Thank you all for having me. It's so great to be here. I remember, Michelle, when you were first thinking up this idea and we're going to do this. My name is Anoa Changa, and I'm a movement journalist based in Atlanta. So I freelance and write in a bunch of different outlets. I also host a podcast called The Way with Anoa and a video series with a Southern-based magazine called Scalawag. The series is called As the South Votes, focusing on voting rights and voter suppression in the South. My focus tends to be on electoral justice, voting rights, and culture. I love to infuse the way in which our folks are experiencing and living life in everything that we do. And I'm also outgoing but founding board member of the Chisholm Leadership Academy. So it's like, I love for us to be the baby sister organization for y'all, but Chisholm Leadership Academy was founded 2 years ago here in Georgia, probably similarly situated, but looking at middle school and high school girls and helping them to have, girls of color, helping them to have the strength and support necessary for being involved in civic and public life roles and civic and public life. So I'm just really excited to be here and get into the conversation with y'all, and I will turn it back over to you, Sandra.
All right, well, I'm going to flip it to Michelle. We have some excellent panelists here, and I'll let Michelle, as many of you already know Michelle, the founder of Shirley's Kitchen Cabinet. Go ahead, Michelle, introduce us to why you are joining our panelists today and give us a little bit more about Shirley's Kitchen Cabinet.
Yes, well, outside of founding Shirley's Kitchen Cabinet, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, I started to amplify the voices and power of Black women through education and advocacy so they can be better advocates on the issues that matter to them. I am a political and communication strategist and consultant. That is the work that I do when I'm not working on Shirley's Kitchen Cabinet. Shirley's Kitchen Cabinet came about through my work in politics and communications. I worked for Bernie Sanders as a national African-American outreach political director, worked on the minimum wage statewide ballot initiative in a senior role, worked for Chris Koster in his gubernatorial race as a political director in a senior role. And then having worked in all of these roles and many more, worked for candidates up and down the ballot, different ballot initiatives, I just found that the voices of Black women were often ignored, not appreciated, and set aside for other priorities. And so that's what made me start Shirley's Kitchen Cabinet. But I do enjoy the political advocacy and communications work that I do. I've been awarded for the work that I've done in politics. I am an AAPC, American Association of Political Consultants, 40 under 40 awardee. I also was honored with campaigns and elections, up and coming political leaders, both in 2017. I'm the first Black woman and the first woman operative to have gotten both awards in the same year. So just want to continue to take the experiences and expertise that I have and bring it to the communities that need it most. Because if we didn't learn anything in 2016, we can learn it again in 2020. Black women lead. You need to trust Black women. And Black women create change for everybody that impacts everybody and helps all people win. So thank you, Sandy, for the opportunity for the introduction. And I'm so excited to be here with Kelvin and Anoa. I know both of these excellent experts in different capacities. So Anoa and I have sat on panels before at a national level at Netroots, and I enjoy her commentary, and I think she's very intelligent. And Kelvin is beyond a mentor and one of the reasons why I've been successful in the work that I've been in. And it's very important to have Black leaders who are in this space to help bring others along, and he does that. So excited to be here.
Wonderful.
Well, thank you, Michelle. And as y'all can see, we have experts here at this table, here and right now with what's going on, this moment of uncertainty, this moment of celebration for Black women and for the Black strides that we've made in 2020 election. We're also here to figure out what is going on with this presidential 2020 election piece. So I want to dive into that. Where are we with the presidential elections right now? We're still waiting on votes to come in. There's a sense that Joe Biden is going to win. What's holding that up? Can we speak to that? What's going on? Kelvin, maybe we'll jump into you first. What's going on?
So in a lot of these cases, what you're seeing is the different states have different laws, and sometimes those different laws impact how the vote count actually works. Giving you an example, Pennsylvania, for instance, because there's some delay right there. We're waiting for those results to come in. As we speak right now at this particular moment, Biden has a lead in Pennsylvania of about 16,000 votes. He's 49.5. Trump is about 49.2. But the interesting dynamic is that Pennsylvania passed a law recently, and I think some of that had to do with COVID, where mail-in ballots is significantly different than what they've had to experience in the past. And so some of this for them, it's a first-time scenario. And when there's a first-time scenario situation like that, it takes time to do things that they've never done before. And so that's one thing, not an excuse, but it's an actual fact. The interesting dynamic there too is that it was a Republican legislature, both on the House and Senate side, that passed the bill that basically now starts to count those ballots the way they're counting it. And if you talk to anybody within Pennsylvania, especially government, they're taking the attitude that we're going to get this right. We're going to count the votes as they come in. We still all have to deal with the fact that any state has to count provisional ballots. You count the ballots that come from overseas as it relates to your servicemen and women when they're voting overseas. So if you're going to take the opportunity and the time to count all of those, that may be an indication in some of these cases why it's taking so long. We're still about 6 states right now where it has not been called by one of our journalistic organizations. I think AP calls, NBC, ABC, CBS, they sometimes call different states. And so they have not called those for the reasons that we're talking about right now. Most of those ballots are not counted. There's not a statistical number that puts it over the top in such a way that they want to count it and call it for somebody. So I think you're seeing a little bit of that as the states have different laws in terms of how they actually count the ballot.
Well, and there was such an influx of voters voting early. We've had some of the highest rates of whether it be absentee or mail-in voting that we've ever had in this nation. Even in Missouri, the Kansas City Election Board, at 6 days out from opening absentee balloting and voting in person, saw a rate of 10 times the number of people coming in and voting early than they saw in 2016. And so on some level, our systems are overloaded at this point. And so they're having to, as Kelvin alluded to, figure out ways to deal with the issues of having an influx of voters. In Georgia, I know in other states, you've got the issue of curing ballots that then adds another layer of making sure people's votes count. So you have to be appreciative of the work of those volunteers to make sure that every vote is counted and that they are doing the hard work, working the long hours to make sure that every vote counts. But there's a lot to count. There's a lot of work to do. And Noah can probably speak more to that, the
I
vote
would just
curing.
also add, because but both of you laid out is absolutely correct. I mean, Kelvin is, we are a hodgepodge of election systems across the country. Yes, we have the one federal system of elections in terms of the presidential, but we are at the mercy of not just 50 state secretary of states, but the various county level administrators, because even as Kelvin was saying, it's different for different states. The administration of those laws and regulations also differ per county within each state. Right here in Georgia, we have 159 counties. The second thing I would add is I think the media had a real role to play in helping to prepare people for this moment we're in right now. Election advocates, election specialists, democracy specialists for months now have actually been warning that we needed to be very careful how we talked about the election, how we covered the election, because we have seen astronomical increases in the use of absentee ballots and in areas that expanded to vote by mail. We do have the early voting that happened. And if you're early voting in person on machines, that does not necessarily change the tallying process in the same way that when we're counting all these different ballots by whether they're hand counts, optical scanners, whatever the case may be. And so this needs to have like a very quick answer. I understand the election was like 3 days ago. We still don't have a definitive answer. But as folks have pointed out, with Bush v. Gore, we did not have a definitive answer for a month. Right.
Right.
And so like this rush to know right away, I get it. But at the same time, that's more been a manufactured like thing from media needing to be the first to call and the first to respond, and not necessarily when we think about how far out certification deadlines actually are for boards of election and secretary of states across the country. It's in some instances it's a week, 10 days, 2 weeks. California, North Carolina, there are several states that won't have their final vote tallies for quite some time, right? And so these are things that we kind of just need to be patient and just understand, like both Michelle and Kelvin have said, this is a sign that things are working as they're supposed to. The last thing I would say is like, we all need to do our part in terms of disinformation, whether it's debunking the nonsense that comes from the current president in terms of undermining this nonsense about don't be counting illegal votes, all votes that have been cast. And there's no indication that there's ever been some astronomical amount of illegal or improper voting that has ever happened in the modern age of elections, especially now we're talking about federal elections and all different provisions. Most of us live in states that have voter ID laws. When we talk about signature match issues on absentee ballots, there are so many safeguards built into the system that we know things are working the way it's supposed to. So we all just need to just breathe and hang in there for a little bit longer, because we're gonna have an answer. But we just have to breathe and hang in there just a little bit. Like my brother keeps texting me daily. He's like, I get all these text messages from people telling me I need to vote. Now nobody's telling me what's going on. And I'm like, breathe. We're gonna find out something very soon.
Well, I am so happy that we have this panel of experts to break it down for us, because I definitely have just turned my television off because I keep seeing these news people talking about they sleeping in. I'm like, I'm not sleeping in with y'all to wait on this decision. I need to take a breather, like you said, Anoa, and relax and like know that it will come. So thank you for breaking that down for us. But as I think from my mindset of a voter, I know I put my vote in and every vote counts and my vote matters. But can you all talk about the Electoral College? Break that down a little bit more, because I know that that's a huge part of the decision-making process. Can we discuss that and translate my vote into how the Electoral College votes?
Yeah, the road to 270 is paid by the Electoral College. So that 270 number is the number of Electoral College votes that are needed in order for a president to be declared. And each state is given a certain number of Electoral College votes. There's a total of, I think it's 538 total electoral votes. The 270 marks an absolute majority. It's over 50%. And each state is given these electoral college votes based on the number of congressional delegates they have represented in Congress. So in Missouri, we have 10 electoral votes because we have 10 members of Congress in our state. In Kansas, I think there are 6. The 10 in Missouri are the 2 senators, and then the remaining 8 are the House of Representative members. And when we think about the census, I know, we just got over this big hump of trying to get people to sign the census. That's where the census becomes important, because the number of representatives you get in Congress and the House of Representatives is predicated on census data and how many people are in your state. In Missouri, we lost a representative, I think it was in 2010. Kelvin, he's a historian, he's the resident historian here, so he could tell me if I'm wrong. But in 2010, we lost a seat due to the census data showing that we had a drop in population. But I digress. So each state has a number of electoral votes. And so when they're talking about counting Pennsylvania and their 20 electoral votes, that's where it becomes important. When we talk about Nevada and the 6, that's where it becomes important, because those are the votes needed to get to that 270. The role that it plays with you as a voter is most states have a winner take all policy or practice when it comes to electoral votes. And so in Missouri, for instance, if the popular vote goes to Trump, then all of the electoral votes that Missouri has then are cast for President Trump, who is president. We'll see if that's the case here in a few days.
Not my president.
Right. But that's where those votes go. If in Kansas, the majority of votes are for Vice President Joe Biden, then all 6 of the state's electoral college votes go to Joe Biden. I think that the only difference is in Nebraska, where some of those votes are divided and based on certain county turnout. And so I think in Nebraska, I think Joe Biden got an electoral vote, and then the rest went to Trump. Of the 4, that's the only exception. And so again, as you are seeing the analysts, do this counting, they're not counting the popular vote. They talk about the popular vote, which is the actual number of votes cast for a candidate, but they're talking about those numbers are the electoral college, because that's what's going to determine a win. You can have a situation where a candidate wins the popular vote, but not the electoral college, because of the way the numbers are drawn. We saw that in 2000. We saw that again in 2016, oddly enough, with Republican candidates looking to get into office. Of all of the years we've had our electoral system in America, there's only been 5 times where a candidate received the popular vote and did not get the vote of the electoral college. The other 3 times outside of the year 2000 and 2016 were in the early 1800s. So I think that's why you're starting to see calls for the electoral college to be overturned, because as of late, we're seeing, and as in recent times, we're seeing where the popular vote isn't the deciding vote for who actually becomes president. But overturning the electoral college would be a feat in itself. It would take a constitutional amendment, and you'd have to have the support of Congress, the Senate and the House. And right now you have a Republican majority. So that would be difficult to pass in the first place. Kelvin and Anoa, feel free to jump in with your thoughts, but that's how the system is currently working. And those are the numbers that pundits are talking about.
I think you broke that down very well, Michelle. And I wish that you would have that conversation with my 14-year-old daughter, who doesn't understand why we have an electoral college vote, because in her lifetime, if you think about it, she has basically witnessed a vote, as it relates to 2016 and Hillary, and it was, 3 million votes more than the president got, but yet he's president. And now we're looking at a situation today where we do know for a fact that Joe Biden will have more votes than the current president. And then what we're waiting on right now is what that electoral college vote. It's very likely that they're going to be synonymous with each other. And in those cases, really, that kind of puts it away for all of those conspiratorial theorists out there that says, well, one thing versus the other thing. Look what happened 2016. Look what happened 2000. I think what we're seeing right now, even though they're still counting the votes, last time I checked, the nation, we're about 92% right now as I talk. And so for the most part, Vice President Biden has a 4 million vote lead. There's no way that Trump is going to be able to overcome that. So he's going to have more popular votes. He currently sits at 253 electoral college votes right now. To your point earlier, If they were to call it as it relates to Pennsylvania, which has 20 electoral college votes, that's going to put him over the top right there. Game over. All the other states, you can't catch up if you're President Trump. So it gets to be a math situation right about now.
Just to make sure, go ahead, Anoa.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Just to break it down in a smaller bite for me, which may be for other people. So for states, they have electoral votes. Some states have different amounts. You said it's common practice that if this, let's say Missouri, has a majority for Donald Trump of popular votes, then most likely Donald Trump will get all of the electoral votes. But in certain states, that's different.
No, okay, that's true for 49 states.
Except for Nebraska.
Except for Nebraska, where it's divided. And in each state, the candidate that gets the popular vote gets all of the electoral votes, and period. And so you have, there have been instances in history where the electors with the Electoral College have cast a vote for someone who was not the popular candidate, but those situations were rare, and it was like someone died, and that's why that didn't happen. And in 2016, I think it's 32 states put laws in place to make that illegal. And so if all the popular votes in Missouri went to
Trump, a Supreme Court case too that came down that said electors can't be faithless.
So
that's the exact term, faithless electors, in which they go in and vote against what the people essentially have said that they wanted through the popular vote. And so it's winner take all. If Biden gets all the, the majority of the votes in Kansas, he gets all 6 electoral college votes. They go to his pool of votes.
And that is very helpful, because for me, it connects how my vote matters. Because sometimes I've thought about, okay, I'm voting, or I've heard people say, well, we vote, but the Electoral College chooses. But the idea is, if the majority is voting for said person, then all of the Electoral College's votes go there. Thank you for breaking that down, because it makes it make plain sense to my direct vote. Anoa, you wanted to add something into that piece?
Yeah, you brought you teased some of that out already in terms of how like our individual votes as voters within a given state, feed into whether or not an electoral college votes would go to a particular candidate, but also in just thinking about how we're talking about when folks talk about like the popular vote should just take all. Part of what we see then is like larger states that are, skew a certain way, people could just run up the vote total in those states, forget everyone else, and technically the popular vote would win. So whenever we're talking about alternative systems, we need to also be thinking about like, how are we making sure that everyone's vote counts? Like I'm sure y'all feel this in Missouri. I feel it down here in the South in Georgia. Like there are people who have overlooked our states, overlooked our districts because it was easier to invest, or they thought they could hedge better in different ways, or appeal people in a certain way. And so what we're seeing, the conversation around electoral college did get a lot of attention and heat because of what happened in 2016, but they were not like really parsing through like why we saw that outcome, right? We saw a lack of investment in Midwestern states like Wisconsin and Michigan. We saw no investment really in Southern states like Georgia and North Carolina in that cycle. And so you saw states like Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin that had gone for Barack Obama, then suddenly not go for Hillary Clinton. And that was a deficit. So even though you had amazing turnout in states like New York and California that contributed to that popular vote total, you did not actually have that state win in those other states that are absolutely important as well. And so somehow we have to shift in our politics where all the voters in all the different states, that we have some type of formula ultimately that actually makes sure that we're considering everyone's vote. Because part of my concern as folks are advocating for, we need to be just looking at the popular vote, is that you have these huge populations in California and New York. And as long as you have the numbers coming out of those 2 states, forget the rest of us. I mean, there's already a dismissive attitude towards most of the Midwest, towards the South anyway. So we need to have these real ideas. So I know there's a lot of history about the Electoral College that's not very favorable, and folks get into that too. But like when we're making sure that folks are investing in our communities, that folks are getting out the vote in our states, we are ensuring that we're in a position to lock in those votes. We're talking about the presidential. We talk a lot about Electoral College in terms of electoral politics, but most of our politics is is at the state and local level, and that doesn't involve the Electoral College at all, right? That's a direct one-to-one popular vote scenario. And that's where so much of the change that is happening in our lives is taking place at that state and local level. And so like, I get the frustration with the Electoral College, but sometimes I think that we spend so much time all the way up here that we're not really paying attention to engaging at the state and local level. And when we look at our local elections, we have some of the lowest turnout in municipal elections. And that's what's directly impacting, our day-to-day lives.
I love that point, and that's a good transition to talk about the things that are happening in our day-to-day lives and how the Black vote and Black women are leading in things that are practical to us right now, where the Electoral College doesn't matter, but things like our governor, things like our senators and our congresswomen and representatives and things like that matter. So could we talk about some of those big wins that happened this election season and how that impacts us and what it means for us today?
So, Sandra, one thing that I'm going to start at, because I have to start it, at the very highest level. And we have to give credit to the fact that when they finally call this election, and I'm going to go out on a limb and predict that it would be called for Vice President Biden. But what you also get is his running mate. And when you get his running mate, we have to start the conversation right there with the fact that you have a system that is going to be at the very top of the opportunity for policy conversations that will take place, that we will hope will have an impact on our communities. And so I'm one of these people that have been jaded over time because I've just gotten too old, where I think sometimes policy at the national level has diminished because we're so involved into our tribal politics. And when we get involved in our tribal politics, it sometimes waters down the policy that we need to impact the very day-to-day things that we do. So what does that mean, Kelvin? Periodically, when you get into tribal politics, the old art of compromise that allowed us to have legislation that could put forward things that were good economically for the Black community. A lot of those things involving education, housing, economic development, and those things are sometimes going by the wayward side because we're involved in tribal politics. But when policy comes involved, what we would like to do is have our Congressional Black Caucus, our Hispanic Caucus, our women involved in sitting at the table as those policies are moving forward, because it allows us to do some things vastly different than when just the men were sitting at the table making the decisions. And so, I sometimes will tell you that I went and studied in Sweden, and I studied in Finland, and I happened to study women's studies while I was over there, and how their impact on the fact that women in Sweden are 50% of the political parties, 50% of the governance structure where policy is derived. And when you look at some of those very pro-women, pro-family initiatives, some things that we hope we can get to down the road, education, healthcare, and those things, women were sitting at the table in the majority way, assisting with the making of policy, and were not involved necessarily in the tribal politics. And I'm just going to say, I'm hoping that our dear Vice President will help with some of that, because right now, even if President-elect Biden wins, he's still operating in a Donald Trump world. And that's very likely. And hopefully, Anoa, what you can do down in Georgia is hopefully, get us to that runoff and then get us those 2 Senate seats. But the reality right now is if you still have the Senate in Republican hands, just for instance, and we could talk about this later, but I think the Republicans were very, Machiavellian in terms of what they really did with this president. It was never about Donald Trump. It was about, in my opinion, the judiciary.
Yeah.
in the fact that you've got 250 people now with lifetime appointments appointed by this president, along with three Supreme Court justices who have lifetime appointments with this president. And so in some of these cases, when judges say, I'm only going to follow the law, no, we see judges that are writing policy now. And so when you see that starting to happen, we saw it with Bush v. Gore 2000, and we saw it with, Citizens United. That is Supreme Court and the judiciary now writing policy that impacts all of us in such a way that I'm one of these guys that I look at policy and I'm hoping that Black women will help with the writing of policy, because we will do better when that happens. The politics we have to have, but I really need the policy to be, front and center. I'll stop there.
I think in policy, they come from a different perspective and stance. Like you said, it's not about the tribal politics. It's about really getting there and doing things different for the most part. And I think that when you see that in Europe and a number of their countries' government and leadership, the United States is behind in having women, Black women in general in leadership. This is nothing new for European countries. In New Zealand, they've got a young female president who has been on the cutting edge of taking care of COVID and reparations and all kinds of very progressive issues. So the fact that we now have the possibility, the highly likely possibility that we're going to have our first female vice president and she's going to be Black, like that's huge. But when you look at it on a global scale, we're behind. I think that's one of the biggest wins to come out of this, if nothing else, is that Kamala Harris is likely to be vice president. And hopefully that positions her to create the policies that Black women in particular need to see, and driving that change for Black women and not being abashed about doing so unapologetically, especially since Black women are the reason why they're in office in the first place. And we can't forget that. Not just Stacey Abrams, but the women who have been on the ground toiling, tilling the soil, so to speak, and creating the path that Biden and Harris took to get here today. They've been doing that over years. This is not new. We're just really seeing the fruits of their labor, or recognizing it. Not that it hasn't been there. We've just ignored the fruit of it to this point. And so I think that's the biggest win that we could possibly have out of this election season. But you saw wins in Georgia with Kim Jackson being elected as the first Black female LGBT state house member. Same thing in Oklahoma with Maureen Turner, who was elected to the House of Representatives. Cori Bush in her historic win in St. Louis, and being the first Black woman elected to Congress out of Missouri, the first, and she's progressive, Black and progressive in Missouri. It's just quite the conundrum to be, to be Black, to be female, to be progressive, to,
that doesn't fit in.
No, that does not fit in the Missouri narrative. But you're seeing even in Missouri and in the Midwest, if you look at what happened in 2018, you had a marijuana initiative passed in Missouri. You had minimum wage passed in Missouri. You had government reform and redistricting passed in Missouri. Although we couldn't get
Medicaid extension.
Medicare for all.
Yeah, healthcare for all. Right to work was, demolished in 2016. And so I think that when voters are exposed to the issues, they vote what's in what people would consider their best interest. When you put the tribalism and partisan politics in it, I think that's where things get murky, and it could be murky for a number of reasons. In 2018, when we passed, marijuana redistricting and campaign finance reform and minimum wage, we didn't elect the person at the top of the ticket who would be most likely to carry on those issues if they were elected to Congress. We didn't elect Claire McCaskill. Some people would say, well, people in the rural areas voted against their interests. I think that they vote in their interest. It was in their interest to have minimum wage. It was in their interest to have campaign finance reform. It was in their interest to have marijuana laws be uplifted. And it was in their interest to have a Republican who was going to go in there, act like Trump, follow in his footsteps, and do his bidding. They want it all, and they voted for it and got it. And I'm digressing a bit, but long story short, I think that we saw a lot of wins for Black women across the US. But there were some still missed opportunities, and maybe we can talk about that later. But there are some big wins.
Yes, yes. You all brought up so much between just the two things that Kelvin and Michelle just said. One thing I want to talk about, because we are hearing a lot of hype about it in the news right now, is about Georgia. And we have Anoa here from Georgia and talking about how Georgia could possibly flip from red to blue. Like, what does that mean for us? And what does that mean as we talk about bipartisan politics and all of that? Anoa, could you speak to that part? What's going on in Georgia?
I mean, what's going on in Georgia is what's going on, just to Michelle's point alone, about what we've seen happening across multiple states in the last several years of people organizing and moving a different way of engaging in politics and bringing more people into the fold. I mean, folks credit Stacey Abrams, and rightfully so, because sis is a visionary. But there are so many other folks that have been also a part of building the collective work and effort that has gone into where we are right now with, I forget what the last count, I think it was up like 4,000 votes, Joe Biden over Donald Trump. And I would submit that it would be even greater, but for the fact that we're still in the middle of a pandemic. We have a lot of people that never received their absentee ballots. And there was the fear of potential violence and retribution on actual election day. It was a ghost town in some polling places on election day. Like, I went out to a couple of different polling places expecting to see lines. I mean, folks were prepared to do line warming and really be out there, provide comfort to folks standing in lines. And a lot of us were sitting in parking lots on Tuesday, shocked to see so few of us. But we know that we had amazing turnout during early voting. We know that 2/3 of the increase, not 2/3 of the increase, 2/3 of all of the absentee ballots cast in this general election cycle here in Georgia were for, the Democratic, ticket. So we have seen like that outcome, that turnout. It just was a very different way than what we traditionally saw. But going back to 2013, 2014, when Stacey Abrams sat down with Nsé Ufot, who's the current CEO of the New Georgia Project, and they formed the New Georgia Project to not just register voters, but to increase turnout of Black, of other folks of color, looking at the real coalition that existed here and rejecting this notion that you have to win a certain portion of white working class voters back to be able to be viable, and seeing that there is a pathway if you stick to the issues, if you build a diverse coalition, if you set the tone for what engagement needs to be, then you can win. And we saw Stacey Abrams narrow the gap in 2018 in her own race for governor. And but for the voter suppression of having someone who was himself, like the analogy folks use is that he was both, the opposing team captain, the referee, the general manager, like he was running the entire election and the candidate on the ticket. And so it's so fascinating now.
Like,
he was the Secretary of State at the time.
The elections, and he was running for governor. So he was overseeing the election and the votes being counted.
So not only that, the shenanigans, right? This is a Secretary of State that oversaw like so many different little tidbits of corruption too, on top of the voter suppression. We had a lawsuit going on after the 2017 special election with John Ossoff. There was a server that held vote records from an election that was magically wiped clean in the middle of a lawsuit happening. Like, how does that happen? How do you end up wiping servers clean? Who does that? We saw him on the eve of election day in 2018 lie and say, this is now our current governor, lied and said that the Democrats had hacked the state of Georgia and were trying to fix the election. Ultimately, a study was shown, or research was done, an investigation was found that there was not only no merit to that, as we all knew at the time, but it fed into that fear mongering about Democrats trying to steal elections that we see happening now. And so we know that when they're calling for counting every legal vote now, that is code language for the ways in which they have tried to disenfranchise and prevent folks from being able to participate. But we've seen hundreds of thousands of new voters registered. We've seen folks re-registered who have been purged and removed from the ballot. We've seen young voters. I'm really excited because in our household, I have a 19-year-old and she cast her ballot for the first time this cycle. And so I was actually also nervously watching because we did absentee ballot voting for this general election and for one of the prior there's been so many different elections and runoffs and stuff. I'm getting confused now because of all the everything with the pandemic. But when we voted absentee, like I was sitting there tracking her ballot too to make sure that her signature, like it was all good because of signature match issues and needing to cure ballot, because younger people are more likely to have issues with their signature matching because they're so free. You know, they're not we got grained into us, those of us of a certain age got grained into us about handwriting and making sure, you know, we wrote a certain way if we had to sign checks or whatever we need to do in our professional life. Kids today, most of them have never had handwriting classes, right? So they do something and they keep it going. But
You're
if your
absolutely right.
signature if your
I never knew
signature
how important a signature was. Literally, it'd be like, it ain't even a name. It's just like a scratch.
Your signature is just like something like they can try to use that though to like deny your vote the right to count. And so I remember asking her when she's filling out her ballot, is that how you normally write your signature? So she pulled out her license and was sitting there making sure it looks the same, because that is such a real way. What we saw in North Carolina, we saw like the number of Black voters, like 2-3 times as many Black voters having their ballots be rejected over their white counterparts. And in part, it was because of signature match issues. It was also because of witness requirements. Thankfully, here in Georgia, we just have the signature requirement. We don't have to do attestations, witness requirements. In Mississippi, they have to do you have to get your ballot notarized. So there are so many different barriers. So what we're seeing here in Georgia is absolutely possible. And it's also happening actually in other places too, right? Like you mentioned the different wins and stuff, that clearly was some organizing effort that different organizations and groups had to do for those great wins to happen in 2018. And the same thing we've seen in Mississippi, which just recently overturned a Jim Crow era, their own version of the Electoral College, basically, that was put in place to prevent Black folks from being able to win statewide. That was resoundingly rejected by Mississippi voters. And so whoever's coming next going forward, you know, may have a more fair chance at the ballot. The other thing that I think that what we see happening here in Georgia, what we see happening in other places, is that people are recognizing that they don't have to wait for folks to bless their effort. They don't have to wait to kiss the ring. They don't have to necessarily fall in line and be the chosen one. If they have, you know, the direct connection to voters, and they can make the case and build the capacity themselves, they're going to go out there and do it. And so we're seeing it's not a new way of organizing. When we look back in the history of the work of our predecessors, sorry y'all, it's been a long day, we have seen this type of work happening, right? Like I just got a really great sweatshirt in the mail from a digital organizing colleague of mine, and it says Fannie over everything with the picture of Fannie Lou Hamer with a bullhorn. And so we know the work that Fannie Lou Hamer, we know the work of Ella Baker, we know the work of SNCC and so many other folks going back before, Shirley Chisholm, right? Like we know the landscape that was laid before us, and folks are stepping into that right now and recognizing that we can do multiple things at once. So we can work within our party structures and systems to move things forward. We can also organize outside of those parties and systems and work to build collectives. And I appreciate the conversation that Kelvin and Michelle were having earlier about when we get out of particular mindsets and stop being so entrenched in our personal, like partisan positions, and think about what's for the greater good. Because I really think we need to reframe and challenge others to reframe how we're approaching politics and getting things done, because we're not getting anything done right now except for a lot of fighting that does not do any of us any good, particularly for those of us who still live in states that do not have things like Medicaid expansion coupled with a rural hospital closure crisis, right? So we need to figure, and we're in the middle of a pandemic still, right? We have hospitals closing, we don't have Medicaid expansion, and we're in the middle of a pandemic. So there are all these things on the agenda as folks are looking forward towards municipal elections coming up in the next year, and then our statewide elections in 2022. And people are really fired up and motivated. And you got kids like mine, my 16-year-old is now watching his older sister and his mom vote, and is thinking about like, oh, wait, I get to vote in which election now? So I think we're really seeing a new wave of, you know, civic engagement and the practice of democracy coming into our communities like we used to have back in the 60s, 70s, and probably early 80s.
Thank
when
you for
bring
that.
up like Georgia and you bring up Fannie Lou Hamer, when I think about what happened in Georgia, that's who I think of. Fannie Lou Hamer really laid the groundwork for that kind of rural, urban organizing, bring those voters who have similar issues and needs together to vote in their interests. I think that what's amazing about the New Georgia Project and the work of Stacey Abrams and others on the ground is they also worked outside of the systems that say you have to have certain consultants, and you have to, you know, reach voters a certain way. It's like they built their own table instead of trying to bring a voting chair to the table that, quite frankly, these organizations and Black people are not welcome at. As someone who works as an operative on the inside of these campaigns, the frustration is always with using the same old playbooks and expecting a win. And those playbooks don't often include Black voters, Black women, Black issues, spinning on Black candidates and the like. And so, you know, I'm hearing a lot of discussion about Black men, for instance, and how polls were showing that they were voting for Trump at 20%, and all of these different things. And what I automatically go to is, if Black men are voting for Trump at 20%, what is the party and what are the candidates and what are the campaigns doing to speak to these voters? What are they investing in? Where are they investing resources and time? And so sometimes you have to step outside of the system, because the system isn't built to ensure that Black voices and Black voters are heard. And I think you're seeing that in Georgia. You're seeing that across the nation. You had to do the same work in Nevada for Nevada to flip, right? You had to have this work in Georgia in order to flip Georgia. You will have to have that work in Missouri and Kansas if we want to see Missouri and Kansas flip and the old way of doing things, and it's just not going to cut it.
Mm-hmm. I want to take a moment to ask those attendees who are watching in, please drop your questions into our Facebook chat or drop your questions into the Zoom chat. We want to hear your voice and hear what your thoughts and questions and feelings are about this moment right now, because we're really talking about some real things. We're talking about innovation and how Black folks have continually had to be innovative in this space of American democracy, and how that innovation is moving us forward to showing how our leadership changes the narrative and flips states, or changes the narrative and makes things happen and gets things done. So as we think about all of the things that are happening in 2020, from COVID-19 to our from our healthcare systems, our education systems, and our economy all being shook up, how does the presidential election, the ballot, up and down the ballot, and how does that impact our community, and how do Black people show up in those spaces with this change? And I'll let Kelvin jump us off with that.
Well, that is a very good question, because I'm going to throw something back at you and probably throw something back at the group. I am seeing this very interesting change in patterns of how things are starting to shape. And let me give you an example. Is we do a lot of our tribal politics, like we're doing right now. We're experiencing that in the country. And I talk about moving away from actual policy development. I am starting to see more entities moving into policy development with ballot initiatives and how it impacts policy, because people are moving away, getting frustrated with the elected officials who are practicing tribal politics. So they just go to ballot initiatives. That's exactly what Michelle brought up earlier when you got right to work, Medicaid expansion, marijuana on the ballot, campaign finance reform, minimum wage. Those were all ballot initiatives. But those are policy initiatives that we usually expect our politicians who we vote for to enact policies to take care of those. On the other side of that, we have judges who are now dealing in policy positions, because when you talk about issues involving the Supreme Court, civil rights, or when we talk about voting rights, Section 4, and we talk about issues like Citizens United, Bush v. Gore, all of those issues were judicial in nature. And so I'm starting to see this very interesting dynamic, and I hope we don't get left at the trough on this one, but we better be aware of the fact that there's these changing dynamics that are starting to take place where ballot initiatives, and Michelle, you'll know this one, when it comes time to ballot initiatives, rarely are you seeing Black people that are the operatives in those ballot initiatives, yet they claim like minimum wage, oh, they're for you guys, we're doing this for you. But when it comes time to getting the vote out, when it comes time to media and all of those other things, we're rarely represented. And
I think
so
the most recent example of that would probably be Vote No on 3, in that there was all kinds of messaging and branding, speaking to the racism that the bill had, and that it would, keep Black people from voting. And all of it was true. But to leverage that narrative and then not leverage the skill set of Black operatives and consultants and media messaging professionals to get that message out to the very Black people it would impact was a disconnect that should not have happened, because you had to do the same work in 2016 to get it passed in the first place. Or was that 2018? In 2018 to get it passed in the first place. So I digress. Go ahead, Kelvin.
No, I'm just saying, but to the point that we hope that when we start talking about what takes place in the next 4 years under whoever becomes, president, I've already made my prediction, that when it comes to the policy implementation that speaks to our communities, I just hope it doesn't get lost in the fact that when nothing gets done because it's too polarizing, that what people start to do is just say, hey, you know what, we're going to go to the ballot initiatives, or we're going to take our issue up to the court system, and we're going to let them determine certain things. And what we know and what we feel and what we understand is the ballot initiatives and the court, scenarios, they're almost impacting us more at certain levels than actually the politicians are. Now, that's me going way out on a limb, saying something very controversial, but I know that because it's y'all that, I'm talking to right now, y'all can handle it, y'all can deal with it. But the reality is that's what we're starting to become. So in the state of Missouri, for instance, and we all the way red now, we are more red than we've ever been. We're shifting. As Georgia is shifting in one way, we are solid. And so what happens is Democrats no longer feel that they can get anything done at the legislature. So they just basically go to a ballot initiative. And if they can get somebody to pay for it, then that's what they do. And then ultimately the people running those campaigns are not us. They put us in the menial roles. Oh yeah, we'll let you do some voter registration. We'll let you get out to vote. That was so 1990s, whatever the case may be. But the campaign manager, the actual individuals running the field operations, the person who is actually the media consultant, or the individual who's the political director or whatever, those jobs, we've already got somebody in mind. So my whole point.
Y'all bringing up some good stuff right here, right now. And I want to highlight what this Facebook question came up. The question is, what changes need to happen in the Democratic Party or in a party to bring in more African-American people and leaders, and to attract more African people and leaders? And how can the party meet us where we are? Because I feel like I'm a fly on the wall between Kelvin's and Michelle's dialogue right now. I'm a fly on the wall of an operative. And so let's all put the lens in that spectrum. What do they need to do to bring the African American Party into leadership positions, and to just get us back on track? Because and I don't want to go bipartisan. I don't want to just lean on Democratic Party or whatever, but what needs to be done to bring in the African American voice back into the American democracy?
Go for it, ladies.
When we talk about party politics and engagement of black leadership, or even just Black voters, the party just has to be intentional and willing to invest and spend the dollars. When you, as in the consultant space, a lot of times the spending isn't there because someone's losing money through the budget to spend to get a Black operative on the staff, or that media, budget that, old white boy consultant wants to go to his friend, now has to go to that Black firm. They don't want to lose the money. Sometimes it's just as simple as that. I don't want to cut into my budget to bring you on. I don't know nothing about Black outreach, so I don't know how to control you or manage you in the work that you do. I don't know if your work is even credible because you are coming from a space and perspective and expertise that I have no idea about. And so it's easier for me to just talk the talk and tell everybody that what's going on is racist, and I know, we need to vote for this, than it is for me to actually put my money where my mouth is. I don't know. I'm a bit of a cynic. I think that the party has too much work to do and isn't willing to do it. And that's shown time and time again. And it showed up in this election. There's no reason why this race should have been as close as it was. Period. There's nothing else to even say about that. In the middle of a pandemic with a lying, misogynistic, racist at the helm, why was it closed? And when you look at, I mean, again, it is racism. Racism is one of the reasons why it's closed. The need of white people to maintain power and their perceived power is one of the reasons why it's closed. But when you look at the spending and the strategy of the Democratic Party, it fell flat. There was not the investment that needed to be doled out in Florida to make sure Black male voters and Black people were voting. There was little to no investment in Missouri. Now, granted, it's a red state, but you also have to look down the ballot. What happens at the top of the ticket often impacts what happens below it. And if you look at what happened in Missouri this election season, not only did Democratic candidates get trounced from top to bottom, the gerrymandering on 3 didn't pass. Hell, we couldn't even get it passed that we could take down the Andrew Jackson statue in freaking Jackson County. I've been pulling down statues across the nation. We finally put it on the ballot, so you ain't got to worry about going to jail. You ain't even got to protest. You could have just gone and voted to have that pulled down. We couldn't even get that passed. The impact of losing those seats at the executive level is going to be for 4 to 8 years before you could even see a change, before you can see a shift. And so when we talk about, the party and Black leadership and campaigns, they just have to be intentional about investing. I think that Black leaders have to be intentional about creating pipelines. We talk about campaigns not having Black operatives. If you look at some of these CBC members and their staff and their campaign staff, they're not Black either. I went there. They're not Black either, right? So how do we create pipelines? I'm just saying, how many Black chief of staffs do you have in Congress? Are the Black elected officials in Congress, do they have Black chiefs of staff? Do they have Black campaign managers? Do they have Black political directors? And the argument is often that there are not Black operatives out there, right? We don't exist. People like
there's not enough. Like there's always
I don't exist
in this field.
Okay, if that's the case, then create pipelines, right? If you're gonna hire the white boy campaign manager, then make the deputy the Black woman who's got the skill set, who's got next, make her the deputy. That way, when you run again, you've got someone geared up and ready to go to be your campaign manager.
Well, let's be clear though, right? Let's be clear, because we got so many instances where there's some like somebody's nephew or somebody's body man or someone's wonderkin data intern is suddenly made the director and put over very qualified Black or other folks of color who would never get that same consideration. And I know you know this from your own experience, Michelle, and Kelvin's shaking his head too. So I'm sure from his story and experience, he knows this too. Like, this is one of our earliest conversations that you and I had, but going back in 2016 after the election. And so what I would add to all this is it doesn't even matter where people fall. Like, we're talking about Democrats on the ideological spectrum, whether they're progressive, liberal, democratic, socialist. Like, when they white, they got to be right. And all of us, it doesn't matter if we don't have like the picture perfect resume, we still might not get that position and still might not get that pay. And there needs to be a fundamental shift in the way people are approaching how we're also running the business of the politics side, right? Like how we're organizing and hiring people, like Michelle is saying, having pipelines that bring more people in. But we, like Michelle said, we have to embrace that too, right? And shed some of what has been ingrained in us. The other thing I would say to your question, Sandra, about like, what does the party need to do? I think we don't need to wait for folks to like come to us. We need to be able to set our own agendas. We should have our 100-day plan. What is the 100-day demand? What is the 100-day plan? Because it's very clear. Black voters put Joe Biden in the fast lane to the nomination, was particularly when it came to South Carolina, and not because like everyone loved him so much. I mean, a lot of people were fine with him, but really, like when you listen to older Black voters in particular in the South, I think about my stepmom's parents who talked about how they voted for who they thought would be able to defeat Donald Trump. They voted for who they thought maybe white voters would support, which we need to get out of that mindset too. But we need to look at and see, like, instead of waiting for to finally get repaid for our loyal vote, we need to come with our own agenda, not some platinum plan that's like a page and a half on a napkin or something, like a real concrete 100-day, this is what needs to happen. Like, even if you don't agree with protests, can you please stop throwing protesters under the bus? Because we're seeing data showing that helped drive people to voter engagement, to voter registration efforts. Like, can you stop equating violence on all sides when we literally have people showing up and threatening to blow up the the Philadelphia Convention Center, which is not the same thing as folks protesting police violence. So like, we need to have a different conversation. And even if you don't support or don't agree with the protest, like, we need to like parse out some of these conversations and look at the ways that Black people in particular are having our hands smacked when we are the ones that are consistently standing in the gap and defending this democracy, going back to every single war that this country, before it even was a country, we've been a part of, right? Like, we've been fighting for this country's right to exist and its democracy since its inception. And we have not been rewarded. We're not going to suddenly magically be rewarded. People act like Barack Obama's election was a reward for us. It wasn't. It's great to see Barry. I loved watching the girls grow up, but that was not a reward. But we have to come with a very clear, organized request. I think, instead of waiting for folks to hand us something, because when you wait for folks to hand you something, it's not going to be anything near what you want.
And you don't know who's going to hand it to you at the end of the day. When you look at these states where the votes are, you know, where the votes are going to make the difference in Biden winning, Black people showed up in astronomical rates to vote for Biden. And I think it's in Wisconsin, Black women showed up at 90%. Black men followed with 87%. Both Black men and women voted for Democrats in all of these states where the vote is being challenged at high numbers. And so there needs to be a reward for that, even if it's us coming to the table and figuring out what we asked for. And again, where the Democrats choose not to spend, the Republicans will. Republicans will spend money on radio. They will spend money on TV to get Black people to sit at home, not even to vote Republican, just to not participate.
So here's the interesting dynamic with that conversation that you brought up, Anoa. Right now in the Democratic Party at the congressional level, there is a real hard conversation taking place because of the number of seats that were lost during this election that everybody thought the blue wave would give them. So now that you have a number of these seats that were lost, you know who they're blaming it on?
Absolutely. I heard the tape. I heard the leak.
And so there's this real interesting dynamic that's going to go on, to your point, Michelle, a little bit here, that these women, mainly white, that lost their seats on the Democratic side are now pointing at Nancy Pelosi and others in the Democratic Party saying, y'all went too far to accommodate the protests and the Black Lives Matter movement. And because of that, I lost my seat.
Now, or it's because your racist aunties and uncles in them didn't vote.
Come on now. Right. So, like,
no, go ahead, Kelvin. I know.
Yeah, I'm just giving y'all what's really going on, because we're talking about the party, right?
Yeah.
But the dynamic that what you're starting to see is the finger pointing that goes on. And I found that to be interesting because Donna Shalala down in Miami lost her seat, had nothing to do with Black folks, had everything to do with the Cuban community, who basically came out in numbers because, you know, they were saying nobody came down here from the Democratic Party to basically, you know, say anything against the fact that the Republicans and Donald Trump were saying, you know, it's socialism, socialism, socialism.
Right.
And if you know the history of Cuba and what happened with Castro and the whole socialist situation there, nobody thwarting that. So, but they, you know, when it came to congressional seat in the Democratic Party, that wasn't the issue that's talked about. What's being secretly talked about is the Black Lives Matter movement, and the protests is what transpired to help them lose their suburban seats in some of these places. And because they don't have 245 seats and they've got about 219, 220, right now in the Democratic Party on the House side, there is a real uproar And if you heard about the tapes or whatever else, it's interesting in terms of who they're blaming that on.
Absolutely. And so this is what's fascinating, right? Because there is no accountability of people like elected officials when you're running for office. Like you can't just say like, oh, folks are going to make sure I get elected. Like I don't even understand that mentality. Like people have to work so hard to make sure they're getting reelected. In theory, they should be. And so like when we're also thinking about I can't remember which one of you said this earlier, protecting the down ballots, right? We had a top of the ticket that whatever folks' thoughts are on whether or not courting Republicans and moderate Republicans or the good Republicans or whatever, whether that's a winning strategy or not, that has yet to actually bear out fruitfully. But that also has like an impact on folks down ballot. Why, if this Republican person is coming out and you have Republicans talking to me, why would I vote for you? That gets confusing for voters too. Like, what do you actually even stand for? And so if we don't have folks, like you were saying, like going down to Miami, Florida, I mean, that builds onto the issue that was already happening in Florida in 2016 when people were commenting that there wasn't the right touches and with the Haitian community too in Florida in 2016. So I know the pandemic has made things really challenging for some folks, but I really do feel like the party could not really figure out what the digital, like what shifting in this moment meant in terms of being able to organize. I was really shocked to see that Lauren Underwood was in danger or is still like within a certain number of votes with her seat, right? And so I don't even understand what the DCCC has been doing. Like it's wild to blame people who aren't even in your districts for these different things happening. But it's like, what were you doing? Were you having virtual teletown halls with your community and doing the outreach and stuff? So, I mean, I'm just not really interested in what white women are saying right now anyway, not because white women are like unimportant and are like beneath me, but at the same time, and a larger share of your sisters voted for the outgoing president, going along with Kelvin's prediction. What were y'all doing? Like when we're talking about the larger battle, and so even looking at the Senate races, I mean, Jaylen Harrison in South Carolina and so much promise. I think part of the problem too is folks got too hyped up they made the same mistake twice, thinking that Trump bad. We have 250,000 people who have unfortunately died because of the COVID-19 pandemic and his poor handling. And then we had these polls that said people were blowing out of the water in this. They were doing this, we were doing this. And folks forget that polls don't vote, people vote.
Yeah.
And polls are off, and pollsters have proven again to be off in very important elections. So at the end of the day, I know back to you and Kelvin's point, when we look at the fact that white women voted for Trump in a larger share and white people voted for Trump in larger numbers than they did in 2016, it just makes you question what is going on, not only with the party, but with these different constituency groups. I mean, we saw all those white women protesting in DC with those pink pussy cat hats and everything else. Where were all those women when it was time to vote? So I think when we look at it,
or they voted and their husbands were still voting Republican. I don't know.
or like they do, when they talk to posters, they tell them the right thing and what they want to hear, and then go into the ballot, go into the booth and vote something else. And so when we talk about, strategy and how to engage, there just needs to be unapologetic engagement in Black voters and Black operatives. We look at what happened with Doug Jones in 2016 in the South and Alabama. How many of those Black women who organized to make sure that Doug Jones got in office, how many of them got jobs at the DNC or were leading other campaigns after that?
How many of them got calls for this election cycle when he just lost his seat?
Yes. I would gather venture few, if none. And even if you got the call and you were on the race, you were probably being told how to do your job and about Black outreach by some young white operative who has no idea about Black people outreach or any of that. And he's probably your boss, right? Like, so there just needs to be better investment. And Black people, I think, have to be ready to build their own tables and to do their own thing. And I think New Georgia Project is a good example of that. Shirley's Kitchen Cabinet, we try to be an example of that. Shirley Chisholm always said, if they don't give you a chair at the table, bring a folding chair. And we're just about building a new table. We don't even want to sit at that table. How about we just build our own and do this, because we're totally capable.
See, Thanksgiving is coming up and we talking about sitting at tables and things. I know what table I want to sit at. I want to sit at the real flavorful one with all the soul, with all the greatness. And I definitely think us Black folks can definitely build a nice soulful table along those lines. But we're getting into some real deep, great conversation. And so I want to highlight some of the questions that we're getting up about this conversation. First, trust. The trust of the Black community from the Democratic Party, as we discussed, has definitely been broken. And just in general, in thinking about how constantly over and over again in history, from the women's suffragist movement to enslaved bodies coming over here to build America, American democracy, American politics, America as a nation has been built on the hard work of the Black community. And so, and that trust is over and over constantly broken, and we're not getting, you know, things placed back in our pockets. No money, no recognition, no thank you for all of the hard work that we have done. So as we think about bringing back Black people in America, some people are just tuned out and like completely off and like, I don't want to vote. I don't want to be involved in democracy. I'm just done. What message do we need to send to our brothers and our sisters who are just completely turned off by America, period, and don't want to have anything to do with the democracy, with politics, with anything here? And this is to uplift one of the questions that we got in our Facebook question about just the mistrust and how do we reinvigorate those folks and get us back involved and, you know, set that table.
Well, I'll start and say this quickly. I think we need to change the messaging and how we talk about voting. I think that there's a perception on the part of folks that if I vote, then I'll see change. If I vote today, I'll see change tomorrow. And that's just not how politics works. It's sausage making. It's revolutionary engagement and acting. The civil rights movement wasn't won by one vote. It took voting, it took getting people elected into office, it took protesting, it took a lot of things in the advocacy, a lot of tactics in the advocacy ecosystem to see the change that we benefit from today. And so I think that we need to be very just realistic. Voting is the first step. It's not going to be the end all be all, and you're not going to see change tomorrow. And if you want to see change, you got to take the first step and then figure out, you know, what your place is in advocacy. But the apathy and the frustration is not unwarranted. What we saw in the 2020 elections and this ongoing issue with the presidency and the results is we saw that, you know, close to 50% still voted for Trump. That says, at least to me and a lot of other people, that this country's okay with having a racist at the helm, okay with having a misogynist at the helm, okay with having a guy at the helm who would not deal with a pandemic and is okay with people dying in astronomical numbers from something that may not have been preventable, but could have definitely been handled different. So there was a message that was sent in this recent election that essentially says America doesn't care about Black people on some level. And so then how do you get Black people to then engage in the very system that's telling us we don't care in more ways than one? It has always told us that. So I think that's difficult. But I think we just have to have real discussions about what the system is, how it works, and how we can find our place in it, if there's a place in it for us at all, or the work that we need to do to make sure that the issues that are important to us get advanced.
I do think that there's a moment in time where we have to be our best stewards of real information, real education, because one of the things that I witnessed, not unlike things that I haven't witnessed before, but I think that we've got some people who are really misguided out there, and they promote misinformation, unfortunately, and they're influencers. I can't say, and I'm going to call them out because I have to, but you know, this election cycle, the Ice Cubes, the 50 Cents, the Little Pumps, the Lil Waynes, Kanye, you know, if I keep going, I'm just going to fill it up with brothers that I'm really, really like, really, y'all. Because the misinformation that you promoted out there and some of the things that you said, I wish you would have had some other people around you to help you. I mean, I know that you're an entertainer, and I know that, you know, you want to have a voice, and that's wonderful, but you do have to recognize that in some of these cases, your voices are substantial. They do carry some weight. But when you are in your lane or in a lane that you know nothing about, please, my brother, would you turn that over to somebody else? Because the misinformation that you are spewing, when we saw that, I mean, I'm one of those people that are idealistic, that if I see 94% of African American women voting one way, I really expect 94% of the brothers voting that way. This is just me. But when I see that difference that happened, and I look at that Kanye still got 60,000 votes out there somewhere for somebody that's just a throwaway vote, guys. Mm-hmm. We don't even know what one policy he basically talked about. 50 was talking about my taxes, and then you get Lil Wayne that just happened to be on the reality show, and they throw these people out there with that misinformation. Lord help us with misinformation that we understood back in 2016 that came from the Russians, the Iranians that put us against each other on Facebook and all that other stuff. I'm just hoping that in the future, y'all please help us, brothers. Make sure that when we are educating, that we get good information, not misinformation, because so many of us, and I know that I've had real deep conversations with brothers who I've grown up with, have known for years, and they were telling me some things about voting and how they weren't going to vote and who they were going to vote for. And I'm like, where did you get that from? Facebook? Where did you get that from? Well, I got it off the internet. Let me tell you what they were saying. And I'm like, bruh, we all went to school together. We frat. Man, y'all were taught to critically think. That's what education really is, the ability to critically think for oneself. But I am so surprised at the misinformation that takes place and that was a part of what was going on out there right now. Wow. I just want to say, wow. I hope that we're able to find venues like this one where we get really good information, where we can tell people where we got it from and they can look and make their own decisions. But the level of misinformation that was happening in our community with influencers, oh my God. And maybe it wasn't just politics, but I was real disappointed in some of that, because I think it caused what I saw with the brothers and their voting patterns slip way below what I think it should have been. We should have been right up there with the sisters, not in terms of the actual amount, because you're always going to be ahead of us in a lot of these cases. Brothers that catch cases, we thought that Florida would help solve some of that when they went to the ballot initiative to get these brothers who were on paper, at least off paper, or at least in a position where they could vote. Then they put a poll tax on them. Guys, with this social media world that we live in right now, we've got to find some places where people can have a safe harbor location to get real good information, especially as our journalism, not you, Anoa, as our journalism starts to slip and becomes more blogger driven, where they don't have the same journalistic principles that our folks that are real journalists have. Mm-hmm. So we got to work on how our information is distributed to our people so that it's not misinformation, because once it gets out there and it gets in our brains, some interesting things happen to us.
So Anoa, can you jump in on that and tie in a little bit about engagement of our Black youth who utilize social media a lot for information? So and with your lens in your field, can you talk about how we engage with great information, especially our young Black youth? And that is to highlight one of the questions that was popped up on the chat.
Absolutely. And Kelvin, thank you for leaning into that so that could become the question. I think we're just saying about disinformation, misinformation is absolutely correct. And part of the problem is we're already a naturally suspicious folk, right? And for good reason. We've had Tuskegee, we've had all types of stuff happen to our folks. We have a history of, forced sterilization, all types of things have happened to us as a people. So we're already naturally suspicious of things, right? And unfortunately, like you're saying, Kelvin, some of these posts and things like that, they'll have a seed of truth or something that'll make sense. And one of the things I would say to someone recently, they were like, well, it makes sense to me. But when we are not informed, when we are not engaging with the information about a thing, we can see posts and stuff like that. And yes, it can make perfect sense. And then we'll accept it and run with it. And then you have to like bring it back, like, wait a minute. So there's like, last week was actually a Disrupt Disinfo, a week of action led by Media Justice and some other organizations of color that were specifically looking at the ways that Black and other communities of color have been specifically targeted with disinformation and misinformation. Quickly, the difference. Disinformation is like information that's false, that's intentionally put out there to mislead. And then misinformation is like the sharing of like misleading information, but it's not intentional. It's not being done with the intention to deceive people. It's just, hey, I saw this post and it makes sense to me. So there are like some guidances, and I can share it, Michelle. You can share it on social. Like Reframe and Pen America actually did a whole toolkit to help folks in figuring out how to find out what information is valid information when you're sharing it online. And it's not about like differences of opinions. It's like there are facts, right? And then there are opinions. And it's fine to have your own opinions, whatever. Hopefully they're informed by something, you know, that's concrete that we can point to. But like when we're talking about facts, we were talking about politics, but like with the pandemic is another prime example. All the folks who don't think they need to wear masks or social distance. I mean, T.I. literally had a club full of people a couple of weeks ago for an album release party. And we are still like hitting another wave of the pandemic, right? We're spiking. And so these types of things, and he actually did an interview recently with like Complex Magazine or something, talking about, well, people should just get it and then they can get over it. There's no indication that once you get it, you're immune from it, right? Like, so there's that type of misinformation too. So I really do think we also need to have like these different platforms being responsible. It's not just, well, oh, that's what that person said, it was just a conversation. These people hold a lot of weight when they're talking. In terms of youth, we need to be engaging and empowering youth organizers so that their voices can carry. I am impressed, by what the youngs are doing on social media to inform each other. Again, I have teenagers, and my son actually sends me and my daughter TikToks in our group, our family chat on a regular basis. Mostly it's like uplifting stuff, motivational, but sometimes he'll be like, is this true? Or mom, did you know about this? And so then that opens up the conversation for us to go back and forth about whether or not something was right. Or like he sent me something that was really wild one day. I was like, oh God, no, how did you find that area of the internet already? I thought we had some more time. It was something about being the original people of Israel. It was just so fast. I was like, no, baby, this is not true. He was like, this is fascinating. I'm like, it would be fascinating, but it's not true, baby. Yeah. And so like, we need to go through and kind of talking and seeing what younger folks are doing. But I also think that there are a bunch of organizers out there that are doing in culture, like real culture organizing. I recently wrote a piece for Essence about innovative organizing and culture that the New Georgia Project has been doing, and some other organizations. But one of the things that they just recently did was Twitch the Vote. They've done 3 installations of Twitch the Vote. Now, Twitch, for folks who are not familiar, is a video game streaming platform where folks basically watch other people play video games, but it has evolved, and folks who play video games, they have conversations, they kind of engage. So they've had some like professional gamers from the NBA 2K League and some other folks who are participating in these efforts, some folks who do streetwear design coming together. And so this most recent one, which was on election day, was 12 hours. They had Mae Jemison and Tina Knowles. So younger folks may not know Mae Jemison, but Mae Jemison was the first Black woman astronaut. Talking about my youth.
I wanted to be an astronaut because of her.
Girl. And so like, and then Mama Tina, I was like, wait a minute, Beyonce's mama is going to be on. But so they said, so there was this infusion of culture, of video games, of like street culture, of music and stuff happening, and interspersed were conversations about voting and democracy and why we're involved and what are the issues at stake. And so having these types of conversations that help folks in a more accessible manner versus like a, political meeting setting can also be more engaging. Like and I'm sure this happens in other cities, like here, there's a group of Black men that get together, and it's for Black men, but it's not excluding Black women, but they meet with, teenage boys like my son's age, all the way up to elders, and they come together, they talk about issues, they bring in guest speakers, and those are other types of forums, right? Because I think the more we can get the intergenerational stuff going, because like, I think young brothers would benefit so much from hearing what Kelvin has to say, right? And seeing someone like Kelvin in their lives. Like, I'm thankful that my son is coming up around me doing what I'm doing, and he's getting to interact with folks who run their own organizations and do all these things. So what he thinks is possible for his future is so much different than what me and my brothers thought when we were coming up, because we just weren't exposed to certain things. And so when we're talking about like how to communicate with the young folks, like some of them, they're already on it. Like in one of the articles I did last month, I interviewed some youth from Students Demand Action. And one of the young people I interviewed was 17. She was not able to vote. She's in Birmingham, but she was talking about how she was registering people to vote. Right. And so we have kids out here that understand what's at stake right now, and they're talking to their friends. You know, they're getting on the horn, they're paying attention to these issues. And so we need to continue to nurture and cultivate that, because there's stuff that we can learn from them too. And then they can definitely learn stuff from this. So I think that intergenerational, multi-generational, you know, conversation. Last thing I'll say is, you know, Michelle and I had a panel that we did back in 2016 in Netroots. No, 2017 in Netroots about progressive while Black, right? And Michelle, being the political and magnificent genius that she is, was able to get Congresswoman Barbara Lee to sit on this panel with us, right? And so we are on this panel. I moderated, and Michelle, we had two other panelists, Mary Hooks of Song and Cesar, who is an amazing Latinx organizer and writer, on this panel with us talking about progressive while Black. And so it was so great because we got Congresswoman Barbara Lee and all her greatness, who was a mentee of Shirley Chisholm's, right? She was talking to us about how she came into politics. And she talked about how she was in college, she had her afro and stuff, and she was like, whatever, politics don't matter for my life. You know, she was a young mom, she was with the Panthers. And Shirley Chisholm looked at her and was like, girl. And so that interaction and that conversation with them is how Barbara Lee, who's this amazing congresswoman in her own right, then became an organizer for Shirley Chisholm's presidential campaign, and then became a delegate for her, you know, and ultimately went on to serving in Congress herself, right? And so we're sitting on this panel getting this history lesson, but at the same time, Barbara Lee tells us afterwards that she enjoyed talking with us so much. That cross generational conversation, those interactions, I think are just so important, and we need to nurture those types of interactions and conversations more, because I think it gives our young folks a little bit more grounding, and I think it gives, you know, folks who are more seasoned a little bit more like, okay, y'all coming along. I think folks feel good when they see their legacy in action, and then it's not just, you know, me. It's particularly when folks who come before us are usually the only ones. I mean, some of us are still the only ones out there doing certain things. So, I mean, that's what I think, that intergenerational, I think, is really central to how we bring more young folks consistently into what's going on.
Wow. Well, I love it. I love everything that we've talked about today. And I promise, I swear, because I'm a talker and I'm a listener too. I want to dive more, but just to honor y'all's time, because I know this week, this month, these last few days have been a lot, and I want to make sure to honor that time for y'all. But I definitely look forward to more conversations to dig into exactly what we're talking about, and that's engagement with us, putting us at the front of our engagement, for us, by us, from our eldest, the oldest of our eldest, to the youngest in the cradle. We want to make sure we are connecting with us, for us, and uplifting us. For that very reason, everything that you just said, Anoa, and to tie everything that we talked about, reminds me of the village, of that intergenerational connectiveness, from the outlier who's like, I'm wild, I'm free, I'm out here, to the older woman who's like, I'm still hip and I got it, you know, whatever it takes. We connect. And I think that's the strength of the Black community. That's what makes us so special. That's what makes us this royal family, that no matter how and what the outside does to us, or tries to do to us, we stay connected. And so when we think about the 100-day plan that you mentioned, Anoa, and when we think about connecting our brothers, and when we being strategic, like Michelle mentions, we want to think about that centralized spirit of Blackness to do for us and by us. So thank you so much for joining us today. This expert panelist, I want to just have y'all on all night. I appreciate your words. I appreciate your call to action. I appreciate what you have inspired me to do, to take back to my community and to talk with my brothers and sisters about moving forward. Before we go, before y'all tune out, I definitely want to, as we always do at our Kitchen Cabinet Forum, we don't stop here. We don't stop with just the conversation. We want to keep the actions going. So one action that Shirley's Kitchen Cabinet has going on right now is wanting to uplift the voice of brutality, violence against Black women, specifically police brutality against Black women here in Kansas City. And so definitely sign on to our letter that spotlighting Deja Stallings' case. We'll drop a link about the letter for you to sign on inside of our chat. But we also want to consider a noise challenge of thinking about the 100-day plan for us, by us, and really taking some notes, getting that down, having smaller conversations with our community members, tapping into this chat and on Shirley's Kitchen Cabinets platform and whatever platform you tune into. But share this, like this, spread the word, because we are at the forefront of American democracy, and they just all got to catch up. So thank y'all so much for joining us tonight. Awesome conversation. I look forward to more conversations with y'all and staying connected. So good night. Thank you for joining us, and peace out.
Bye.
Good night.